They brought her to market with her 3 children like livestock tethered to shame. No one offered a thing until one man stepped forward silent as dusk and placed a string of dried fish bones on the table. Not a word, not a price. Just the kind of mercy that don't announce itself. And in a land that forgets women like her, that quiet kindness gave her something no money could. Reason to stay. Chapter 1. The tap of a cane on the auction plank. The sun had barely crested the ridge when the square of Bitter Creek began to hum with its usual heat-born chaos. Oxen lowed, chickens squawked under burlap sacks, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed like a clock that had long since stopped caring for time. The dust swirled under boots and wagon wheels, painting every surface in a dull, powdered brown. Somewhere in that mess of sweat and iron, a woman stood very still on a plank of raised wood. Her name was Maybelle, though no one said it aloud. She held her 3 children close, Ellie, Ruth, and little Sam, like a last defense against the way the crowd looked at her, not with cruelty exactly, but with something worse, indifference. Like she were livestock already appraised. The wind tugged at the faded hem of her dress. A corner of Sam's blanket flapped loose from her grip, and she didn't move to catch it. A man in a vest 2 sizes too tight and a face like split rawhide stepped forward, placing one boot up on the platform as though claiming a tree stump. His voice didn't need the help of a stage. Name's Clyde. That much everyone knew. Now I don't reckon I have to explain why we're gathered here. Y'all know her husband, dead, drank himself into the grave, owing me near $300. Lost his claim, lost his life. Left me with this woman and her 3 half-fed young'uns. He gestured broadly toward Maybelle, as though she were a bushel of overripe turnips. They're mine by debt, ain't personal. Man dies, debt don't. The silence wasn't born from disagreement, but from the discomfort of watching something that should have happened behind closed doors. Maybelle didn't look up. Her fingers clenched Ellie's hand tighter, the girl's small face barely visible behind the curtain of her mother's skirts. Ruth whimpered. Sam didn't speak. He hadn't in months, and simply watched the crowd with wide, too quiet eyes. Clyde's voice dropped a notch. She'll work it off. The girls, too, when they're old enough. The boy, well, we'll see. The crowd stirred, not with outrage, but with shifting boots and sideways glances. A woman near the back whispered something to her husband. He didn't answer. Maybelle raised her head slowly then, not in defiance, but like someone looking for a way out that might have opened up while she wasn't paying attention. Her cheeks were hollow, her mouth set in that terrible line women wear when they've run out of both anger and prayers. When she spoke, her voice barely carried. They're just children, she said. They don't owe you anything. Clyde smiled like a butcher humoring a calf. No, ma'am, but you do, and they're yours. He turned back to the crowd, more for show than anything. Any objections? The wind picked up then. The dry kind that rattles porch signs and reminds folks they live in a place where water gives up first. And then, tap, a sound, sharp and deliberate, not a gunshot, not a boot stomp. A wooden cane tapping once against the edge of the platform. Every eye turned. The man holding it was tall, broad, and quiet in the way storms are quiet before they break. He wore a long, dust-browned coat and a hat with a sweat-dark band. Thatcher Reed. Folks knew him, but not much about him. Ran a ranch out past Widow's Draw. Didn't talk. Didn't trade. Didn't come into town unless something needed fixing. He stepped forward, one measured pace after another, cane in hand, the crowd parting like a river around a stubborn rock. Without a word, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out something wrapped in faded red cloth. He set it gently on the edge of the platform, then unwrapped it. It was a string of fish bones, delicate and sun-bleached, threaded together with red thread so fine it caught the morning light. Clyde squinted. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" Still Thatcher didn't speak. He pulled a small notebook from his coat, scribbled something, then handed it to Clyde. The man read it out loud with a chuckle. "I offer what's mine to take her and the children. No debt, no ownership, only intention." He laughed. "That ain't legal." A few in the crowd shifted again. Some coughed. One woman started to clap, then stopped herself. Clyde tossed the notebook aside. "What are you playing at, Reed? You think I'm going to take some sentimental trinket and let you walk away with, what, a family?" Thatcher pulled a second slip of paper. This time he had written only 2 words. "She's not yours." The moment hung. Maybelle's knees nearly gave out. The children watched, silent and still. Clyde looked at the crowd, looked at Thatcher, looked at the fishbones, the red thread catching wind. And then, like a man folding in a losing hand at cards he didn't know he was playing, he raised both hands and backed down. "Fine. She ain't worth a brawl. Take your charity case, but don't come asking for help when she drags you down like she did the last man." Thatcher turned without answering, stepped up onto the platform. He met Maybelle's eyes only once, and what passed between them wasn't kindness exactly, but something older, like recognition. She looked down at the bones, then to her children, and stepped down. The wind lifted again. The red thread on the fishbones fluttered like a flag. No one flew anymore. They walked out of town in silence, and no one followed. Chapter 2. The fishbone string meant nothing to anyone. They didn't speak for the first half-mile. The road out of Bitter Creek curled through hardpan and sagebrush, a winding path carved by wagon wheels and runoff. Dust lifted from each step and clung to the hem of Maybelle's skirt like guilt that wouldn't shake loose. Behind her, Ellie trudged with quiet resolve. Ruth stumbled with sleep-heavy feet, and Sam stared at the back of Thatcher Reed like he meant to memorize every line of the man's spine. The string of fishbones was still wrapped in that piece of red cloth and tucked in Maybelle's palm. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't thanked him, didn't know if she could. All she knew was the heat of the morning, the hollow ache between her ribs, and the weight of a silence she didn't understand. Thatcher walked ahead of them, steady as a mule, one hand on the cane and the other carrying a leather satchel that looked older than anyone present. He didn't look back, didn't slow when Ruth tripped on a root and skinned her knee. But when Maybelle crouched to comfort the girl, there was a rustle in the dust, and a square of cloth, clean and folded, landed beside her. She looked up. Thatcher didn't turn, just kept walking. She picked it up anyway. By the time they reached his wagon, tied up beneath the shadow of a twisted cottonwood tree, the sun was rising like it had something to prove. He hitched the mule with practiced ease and lifted each child one by one, saying nothing, hands gentle but efficient. When it came time for Maybelle to climb up, he simply offered her his hand, rough, dry, scarred in strange places. She didn't take it. She climbed in on her own. The ride was long, slow, and oddly quiet. No creaking wheels, no snorting beast, no idle talk to pass the hours. Just wind through mesquite, the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk, and the constant rhythm of hooves on packed dirt. Ruth dozed in Maybelle's lap. Ellie stared at the hills like she meant to keep going once they stopped. Sam curled up next to his sister and clutched one of the wagon rails like a boy afraid of floating away. Maybelle held the red-wrapped fishbones in her lap. She didn't know why she hadn't let them fall when he offered them. She hadn't asked for help, hadn't expected it. Maybe it was because he hadn't offered it like help, more like witness, like someone who'd seen something too wrong to ignore and chose, in his quiet way, not to let it pass. Still, she didn't trust it. Not yet, not when every man who ever offered kindness before had reached for something else after. As the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged hills, Thatcher spoke for the first time. "You ever worked a stove that runs hot on pine?" Maybelle blinked. "Sir?" He nodded toward the horizon. "Cabin's got a stove runs hot. Pine wood burns fast. You'll want to keep the damper tight." That was all. He didn't ask her name. Didn't ask if she could cook. Didn't ask what happened to the man who left her 3 children and a debt too heavy for a body to carry. He just offered a fact, like a man might point out a rattlesnake near your boot, or a good shade tree before the heat got bad. Still, something in her shifted. "You always offer pine wood and silence to strangers." His hand tightened slightly on the reins. The mule flicked its ears. "Only when the silence says more than the talking would." They reached the ranch at dusk. It wasn't much. Just a cabin hunkered low between 2 hillocks, a windmill spinning lazy at the back, and a few outbuildings that looked held together by rust and prayer. But it was tidy. The fences were mended, the tools hung proper, the porch swept. A row of laundry flapped on a sagging line, shirts, long johns, a dish rag or 2, signs of someone who lived alone and intended to keep it that way until today. He pulled the mule to a stop, climbed down and unloaded the children first. Ruth blinked awake, clinging to his shoulder before realizing it wasn't her mother. Sam slid to the ground like a cat, eyes wide. Ellie didn't speak, just stood tall and waited. Maybelle climbed down last, hand still clutching the cloth-wrapped bones. He led them to the door and opened it without fanfare. Inside was cooler than expected. Shadows curled in corners. A stove sat cold but ready, and the scent of dry herbs lingered faintly in the rafters. "You and the kids can take the bed tonight," he said, voice even. "I'll be in the barn." She stood in the doorway. "You don't have to do this." "No, ma'am," he said, "but I am." And he stepped back into the dark, leaving them inside. Maybelle didn't unpack. She laid the children down, pulled the quilt over them, and sat beside the stove until the moon was high. Her fingers found the red thread on the fishbones again, tracing the knots. The first thing her husband had ever given her was a pair of gloves, 2 sizes too small and stolen from a cart. The second thing had been a bruise. This string of bones meant nothing to anyone else. But maybe that was what made it different. Maybe it was the first thing that hadn't come with conditions. She placed it gently on the windowsill above the stove and let it catch the light. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Didn't Dare Sleep. The moon hung low over the ridge when the wagon finally quieted for good. The mule had been unhitched. The children laid down, one by one, in a bed too big for their tiny limbs, and too unfamiliar for dreams to come easy. But they were warm, their bellies weren't hollow, and the man who'd brought them here had closed the door gently behind him. That was more than they'd had in a long while. Maybelle sat in the shadows. The room was small. 4 walls made of pine planks that bore the scent of smoke and time. A worn rug sat askew beneath the iron stove, and above it a shelf lined with canning jars, some full, some empty, all labeled in a slanted hand. There was no mirror, no lace, no softness, save for the way the light from the lantern curled in the corners. She didn't take off her boots, didn't loosen her hair, didn't lie down. Instead, she pulled a chair close to the stove and watched the faint glow of coals inside as though they might speak. Sam was curled under the quilt, back pressed to Ruth's. Ellie had shifted closer to the wall, one arm flung over her siblings like a mother guarding cubs. They made no sound, though Ellie's brow was furrowed even in sleep. They, too, were waiting for the other shoe to fall, even in slumber. Maybelle's hands rested in her lap, folded tight. The fishbone string lay beside her, catching glimmers of lantern light like snow in December. She hadn't meant to carry it into the house, but somehow it had come along with her. Maybe because it was light. Maybe because it was the first thing anyone had offered her that wasn't meant to shame or claim. But she didn't trust it. Not yet. The cabin was too quiet, too still. She'd known places like this before. Brief, borrowed spaces where a woman was allowed to rest for one night before payment came due. Sometimes it was demanded at the door. Sometimes after the children fell asleep. Sometimes the price was spoken. Other times only implied. But it always came. Thatcher hadn't said what he wanted. That was what frightened her more than anything. Men who talked could be bargained with. But the silent ones, those were the ones who struck without warning. Like the rattler you never heard before, the pain bloomed. She shifted in her chair and kept one eye on the door. Outside, the night moved in slow rhythm, the creak of windmill blades, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of something small in the brush. But no boots, no voices, just wind. Then a sound. Low, wooden. The creak of a barn hinge. She stood in one breath, her hand on the back of the chair, ready to shield the children with her body if needed. The lantern flickered, the stove crackled, but no footsteps followed. After several minutes, she crept to the door and laid her palm against it. Still warm, she opened it half an inch and peeked out. The yard was silver with moonlight. The barn doors were closed, a sliver of lamplight shining through the crack between them. No movement, no figures. Just the calm of a night untouched by cruelty. She closed the door again. Back at the stove, she crouched to touch the coals, still embered, still alive. She added a log, not because it was cold, but because the crackle might help her stay awake. She didn't plan to sleep, didn't dare. Instead, she watched the flames dance and wondered what kind of man gave up a day's work, a string of bones, and a bed without asking for anything back. She didn't know Thatcher Reed. Didn't know if he'd expect a debt settled in silence. Didn't know if she was being foolish by staying. But what she did know was this. No one had laid a hand on her. No one had looked at her children like they were livestock. And the fishbone string had been placed in her palm like something sacred. That counted for more than she was willing to admit. The lantern burned low. The children breathed slow. Maybelle leaned back in the chair, let her eyes close just a little, and whispered, "Not to God, not to Thatcher, not to anyone. Just let us make it through the night." And somewhere outside, in the barn, a man who did not sleep much either leaned against the wall, hat pulled low, and listened to the sound of quiet that didn't need breaking. Chapter 4. The teacup left by the breezy window. The morning slipped in soft and blue. It wasn't the sound of birds or children that woke Maybelle. It was silence, a kind of hush that didn't feel empty but waiting. She opened her eyes slowly, surprised to find herself still seated by the stove, the back of her neck warm where the fire had burned low through the night. Her body ached, not from labor but from bracing for something that never came. The children were still asleep, tangled in one another like vines that had grown too close to part. Ruth snored softly, her little arm flung across Ellie's chest. Sam had kicked free of the quilt and curled himself beneath Maybelle's shawl. They looked ordinary, not broken, just tired. She rose stiffly, rubbed her hands together to chase out the cold, and tiptoed to the window. The wind had shifted. It moved through the hills like a hush after a long prayer, brushing the edge of the porch and tickling the unlatched shutter with a wooden thump-thump rhythm. Maybelle pushed it open wider. That's when she saw it. On the sill, a teacup. Not new, not fancy, just clean, clay-colored, chipped at the rim. Still warm. Inside it, strong black tea, the kind her mother used to drink when she'd wake before sunrise to knead bread. There was no note, no sugar, no explanation. Only the quiet weight of a gesture that didn't ask for thanks. She stared at it for a long time. Then she picked it up with both hands, sat on the edge of the doorway where the sun had begun to stretch across the floorboards, and drank. It wasn't sweet, but it was good, steady, bitter in a way that reminded her she was still alive. Behind her, the stove had been stoked. The ashes from the night before were gone, replaced with a small pyramid of kindling stacked with care, the fire already catching. Someone had been inside. Someone had lit it. She hadn't heard him. The broom she'd used yesterday now leaned neatly against the wall, the straw retied at the base with a fresh strip of cloth. The floor, though still dusty in the corners, had been swept, not in apology, just maintained. Noticing these things made her chest tighten, not because it felt like kindness, because it felt like space, like someone had noticed her enough to make room. She set the empty cup back in its place and turned toward the wash basin. She didn't need anyone to tell her what to do. The children needed food. The house needed tending. Her hands needed something to do, or they'd start shaking again. Outside, the sun cleared the ridge in full. The hills lit up in dusty gold. From the barn she heard the creak of wood and the low rumble of a man's cough. Then silence again. She pulled her sleeves up, found a rag by the basin, and began. By mid-morning, Maybelle had stripped the bedding, beat the dust out the door, boiled water for oats, and swept the corners twice. Not because it was expected, but because she didn't know how to feel safe unless something around her was cleaner than the thoughts in her head. The children helped in small ways. Ellie folded cloth napkins with the solemnity of a judge. Ruth carried kindling like it weighed 100 pounds, dragging each stick with both arms. Sam didn't speak, but when Maybelle dropped a spoon, he picked it up, wiped it with the hem of his shirt, and placed it on the table without meeting her eyes. Thatcher didn't return until the sun had passed noon. He came in through the back door, boots muddy, shoulders damp with sweat. He paused just long enough to hang his coat and wash his hands at the pump. Then he nodded once toward the children and said, "Y'all eatin'?" Ellie nodded. Ruth smiled. Sam stared. Thatcher looked at Maybelle last, not through her, not above her, at her. She braced herself, but all he said was, "I've got another cot out in the shed. You can pull it in. Nobody should be sleeping in chairs." Then he walked back out. Maybelle stood in place long after the door clicked shut behind him. She wasn't used to kindness that didn't need witnessing. She wasn't used to being left alone without being abandoned. She walked to the back shed 20 minutes later, found the cot folded against the wall. The mattress smelled of cedar and something faintly sweet. Not perfume. Soap, maybe. A man's soap. She carried it inside, set it by the stove, and covered it with the blanket Ellie had used on the wagon. It wasn't her bed, but it was a bed. When night came, she made a pot of beans, not because she was asked, not to say thank you, but because she wanted the smell to mean something, because she wanted to mark the air, to leave behind something warm. When the beans began to simmer, the children sat quietly around the table, cheeks flushed from the stove's heat. Maybelle ladled out bowls with a wooden spoon, passing each one like it was fragile. Thatcher entered just before they ate. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He didn't sit at all. He stood by the wall, nodded once toward the pot, and said, "Smells like something worth staying for." And then, just like that, he stepped outside again, the screen door creaking behind him. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Maybelle laid on the cot and stared at the fishbone string on the windowsill. The red thread still caught the breeze. And for the first time since her husband died, she closed her eyes, knowing no one would touch the doorknob. Chapter 5. Each child a different color. The sun came up slowly the next morning, as if it knew not to rush. A thin veil of mist clung to the field behind the barn, and somewhere far off a hawk called across the ridge, its voice sharp as broken glass. Maybelle stood at the basin, sleeves rolled, washing the tin bowls from breakfast. The water was cold enough to sting, but she welcomed it. It reminded her she was still here, still standing, still serving three little souls who, needed more than just food. Inside the house, the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt careful, like a room that had learned how to breathe with someone new inside it. Ruth was the first to break it. She was on the porch with a strip of calico in her lap, tugging it back and forth through her fingers like she was trying to wring secrets from the cloth. Her lips moved, murmuring words Maybelle couldn't quite hear. When she stepped outside, Ruth looked up, blinking slow. "I'm telling the cat a story," she whispered. There was no cat, just a faded lump of burlap on the porch rail where Ruth had placed her attention. Maybelle didn't correct her. She'd learned that sometimes children survive things by pretending the world still listened. Inside, Ellie was organizing the shelf above the stove, not placing, not exploring, organizing, lining up jars by size, by color, then by label. She was silent, efficient, and frowning just enough to show how seriously she took the task. Every few minutes she glanced out the window, not toward the barn, not toward the hills, but toward the door, like she expected someone to knock, or someone to come back who never would. And then there was Sam. He sat near the hearth, legs folded, back straight, eyes fixed on the flame inside the stove like it might speak a language only he understood. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was concentration. He didn't flinch when the wood cracked, didn't blink when soot fluttered down. He just watched. Later that day, Maybelle found him outside, kneeling in the dirt beside the barn. In his small, dirt-lined hand was a rusted horseshoe, and beside him lay 3 rocks he'd arranged into a near-perfect circle. She didn't ask what it meant. She just sat beside him until the sun moved 2 fingers across the sky. That evening, Thatcher returned with 3 boards of soft cedar tucked beneath his arm. He didn't say why, didn't have to. He brought them into the kitchen, laid them across the table, and pulled a whittling knife from his coat. Then, without ceremony, he carved 3 names into the wood: Ellie, Ruth, Sam. No last names, no titles, just names. When he was finished, he ran his thumb across the grooves and passed the board to Maybelle. "You'll need chairs that fit 'em," he said, voice low. "Those legs are too short for mine, and too long for sittin' crosswise on the floor." He left the boards on the table and walked out into the twilight. By the time supper came, 3 stools stood at the table, none quite even, none exactly the same, but all sturdy, made by a man whose hands understood weight. The children didn't say thank you, they didn't have to. Ellie ran her fingers over the letters like they might disappear if she didn't memorize them fast enough. Ruth sang a song under her breath and placed a rock beside her seat, a smooth one, pale and warm from her pocket. Sam sat the quietest, but he smiled, not with his mouth, with his whole face. That night, Maybelle stood by the window while the children slept. The fishbone string was still there, the red thread faded now by sun and dust, but intact. She thought about how each of her children carried a different kind of silence. Ellie's was sharp. Ruth's was dreamy. Sam's was solid as oak. They were hers, and yet she was still learning who they were, without fear shadowing every corner of their small bodies. Behind her, the 3 stools creaked as if settling into place. In that moment, Maybelle understood something she hadn't dared believe since Bitter Creek. They weren't passing through anymore. They were beginning to leave marks. On wood, on floorboards, in the space between breaths. This place was remembering them. And for once, She wasn't afraid of what it meant to be remembered. Chapter 6. The Man Who Didn't Step into the Kitchen. The kitchen smelled of hot cornbread and cooled ash the next morning, the kind of scent that clings to worn cotton and quiet hope. Maybelle stood at the stove, wiping her hands on a flour-smudged apron, listening, not for trouble but for the familiar rhythm that was settling into this house. She'd noticed it now, in little ways. No one told her to cook, but the pantry was always stocked just enough. A sack of beans left on the bench, flour in a jar with the lid screwed tight, firewood stacked where she could reach it, not where it used to lean tall and high near the shed. Someone had thought about her, quietly but on purpose. Still, Thatcher Reed never crossed the threshold of her kitchen, not once. He might set a bag down on the porch or knock lightly to let her know a bolt had been fixed, but he wouldn't sit, wouldn't linger. He left space like a man who'd once lost something in a room like this and now didn't trust himself not to break it again. Maybelle didn't question it. She understood the language of men who mourned in silence. That morning, Ellie had decided the spoons had to be reorganized. Ruth made up a lullaby for the goat out back. Sam sat by the fire and held a button in his hand like it was a compass. Maybelle found herself humming as she worked. Not loud, just enough for the steam from the kettle to carry it somewhere past the rafters. Then she heard the knock. 3 soft taps. She opened the door and found a coat hanging from the post. A child's coat, stitched at the sleeve where it had frayed. Washed, though the stains didn't come out. She knew this coat. Sam's. He must have left it out in the barn last night, and now it was back. Underneath it, tucked on the porch bench, sat a small wooden box. She opened it and found nails sorted by size. A piece of chalk. A sliver of beeswax wrapped in paper. A note that read, in handwriting so precise, it almost looked like it had been carved. Drawer kept sticking. Fixed it. This helps. No name. No fuss. Thatcher Reed had never stepped into her kitchen, but he had opened the drawer where she kept the cutlery and decided she shouldn't have to jiggle it each time just to get a spoon. Later that day, she found a new peg hammered into the wall by the door. Her shawl fit there like it had been waiting its whole life to hang. One afternoon, Sam wandered too far. The sky had turned the color of steel, wind picking up in short, sharp bursts across the field. Ellie was stacking books inside. Ruth was talking to the shadow of the goat again, but Sam, quiet Sam, had followed something. A bird, maybe, a cloud, a memory. Maybelle's heart sank when she saw the empty spot by the porch, where he'd been tracing letters in dirt just minutes before. She called his name. Once, then again, no answer. Then she saw Thatcher, a silhouette against the far ridge, tall and steady, walking back with Sam cradled against his side. Not carried, not scolded, just held, like something precious that didn't yet know it was. Thatcher set the boy down at the porch, handed him a pine cone, and ruffled his hair without a word. Sam walked inside, tucked the pine cone under the stove, and sat cross-legged like he'd never left. "Sorry," Maybelle whispered as Thatcher turned to leave. He paused. "For what?" She didn't know how to answer. Maybe for needing help. Maybe for being too broken to stop shaking. Maybe for still thinking, somewhere deep inside, that someone would punish her for loving her own children too loudly. Thatcher didn't ask again. He just nodded once and walked away. That night, Maybelle sat alone by the fire after the children had gone to sleep. The kettle hissed soft, the flame low and blue. Her hands ached from kneading dough, from sweeping, from living. But her heart was quieter than it had been in months. She looked around and saw the signs. The 3 stools worn in now with use, the peg by the door, the fixed drawer, The line of stones Ruth had placed beneath the window, tiny markers of territory claimed, not in defiance, but in belonging. And still, Thatcher never came to sit. There was something noble in it, something painfully kind, a man holding back not because he didn't care, but because he did. She picked up the coat again, felt the rough patch Thatcher had sewn onto the elbow. The stitchwork was awkward, but it held. She held the coat close to her chest, eyes closed. He wasn't feeding them out of guilt. He wasn't fixing the porch for thanks. He was tending something without naming it, and that, more than anything, undid her. Chapter 7. Clyde comes back the first time. The wind blew hard that morning, dry and sharp, the kind that came down from the mesa and scraped the sky raw. It carried with it the smell of dust, mesquite, and something else, something that made the hair on the back of Maybelle's neck rise before she even saw him. She was kneeling in the garden, teaching Ruth how to press onion bulbs into the dirt just so. Sam was nearby with his pine cone, tracing slow circles into the soft earth, and Ellie was up by the porch, book in hand, turning pages like she understood every word. It had been a good morning, the kind you forget to call peaceful until it ends. The sound of hooves shattered it, slow, deliberate hoofbeats crunching the sun-baked path, not rushed, not uncertain, just expectant. Maybelle didn't have to turn around. She knew who it was. Clyde Mallory. His voice arrived before his shadow. "Well now, don't this look domestic?" he drawled, sliding off his tall gray mare like he'd done it 100 times on this land. 3 little birds, a widow, and a house that ain't hers. Maybelle stood slowly, dusting her hands on her skirt. Ellie moved without being told, ushering Ruth and Sam back toward the porch. Thatcher was nowhere in sight. "You've made your point, Clyde," Maybelle said, quiet but even. "You can go now." Clyde smiled like he'd just been offered pie and didn't have the manners to refuse. His eyes flicked across the porch, the laundry line, the half-built chicken fence. "You always did have a way of decorating what wasn't yours." His coat was new, so were his boots, but the same hunger lived in his eyes, the kind that didn't crave food or money, but control, the kind that didn't need a reason to hurt someone, just permission. He took a few steps forward, pulling something from his breast pocket, a folded piece of paper, crisp and official-looking. "Paper says your husband owed me $312, 40 head of cattle and a plow team, give or take. Since he's no longer breathing and no one disputed it, the debt's still livin', and last I checked, so are you." He laid the paper down on the porch rail like it might bite someone if mishandled. Maybelle didn't flinch. "Thatcher has a copy of the agreement," she said. "You signed it. Said clear, you let me and the children go. No livestock, no land, just us." Clyde grinned wider. "I was drunk. That don't count in court. Blood or no blood." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out something small, cold, metallic. A silver coin, thick, worn, too heavy to be pocket change. He turned it in his fingers before placing it gently, deliberately on the porch rail beside the paper. "This here's a marker," he said. "Means claim, not legal, not yet. But folks around here remember what a marker means." Then he tipped his hat and said, like he was offering a blessing, "I'll be back to collect." Maybelle didn't touch the coin, didn't touch the paper. She simply watched him ride away, dust rising behind him like a scar across the earth. 10 minutes later, Thatcher arrived from the west field, saddle creaking under his weight, face sun-seared and unreadable. He didn't ask what happened. He just looked at the coin, looked at Maybelle, then walked past them both. Into the house. For the first time, not the kitchen, not her room, but to the hearth. There he took a length of mesquite from the wood box, stirred the coals until they roared, then picked up the silver coin. He held it between two fingers like it meant nothing and everything, and he dropped it into the fire. It hissed, spat, rolled toward the center of the flame. Maybelle watched, heart beating wild. He didn't say a word, but something in the room changed. Like a line had been drawn, invisible but permanent. That night, as the wind howled outside and the coin melted into black ash, Maybelle sat by the fire and didn't ask questions. She simply stayed near, not to be protected, but because she knew deep in her chest that someone had just taken her side without needing to explain why. Chapter 8. The Letter Found in the Hearth. The wind died by morning. It left behind a silence so thick it seemed to muffle even the boards of the porch, just the creak of an old rocking chair that no one sat in anymore, and the occasional flick of Ruth's small fingers through the fur of a calico cat that had decided to stay. Maybelle had risen before the sun, not out of duty, those days were behind her if they'd ever truly ended, but because sleep came only in handfuls lately. Her bones still held the echo of Clyde's voice, the weight of the coin, the hiss of its burning. She needed movement, something to set the world back in place. So she went to clean the hearth. It wasn't truly dirty, not by ranch standards, but soot had a way of hiding stories, and Maybelle needed to lay her hands on something real. She reached behind the brickwork where ash sometimes collected, scraping out clumps of char and a few forgotten nails. Then her knuckles struck something soft, folded paper, old and browned, tucked between two stones. Someone had once thought to hide it well. The letter was wrapped in oilskin, cracked with age. Unfolding it felt like parting spiderwebs in a place no one had entered in years. It was addressed to her, in her husband's handwriting, but the ink was shaky. The lines are uneven. May, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Maybe ran, maybe dead. I thought I could fix it. The land, the debt, the man I became. I wasn't enough. Not for you. Not for them kids. If Clyde comes calling, I hope someone better than me stands between him and what's mine. Don't forgive me, I don't deserve it. But no, I didn't stop trying until the trying hollowed me out. W. There was no I love you. No redemption, just a map of a man's failure laid bare in shaky lines. But on the back of the letter, hastily sketched in charcoal, were three small figures. Stick-like, almost childishly drawn, but she knew them. Ellie, Ruth, Sam, and a fourth figure, smaller than the others, drawn with a broken line like the pencil had slipped. A baby that hadn't made it past its first week. She ran her fingers over the line, once, twice, then folded the letter back, and she burned it, not out of anger, not out of shame, but because there are some goodbyes that can't be carried forward. What she kept was the wrapper, the old oilskin with the drawing. She pressed it flat and slipped it inside the pocket of her apron. Then she walked outside. Thatcher was splitting logs near the barn. Shirt sleeves rolled, sweat along his brow, axe rising and falling in a rhythm that never changed. He didn't pause when she approached, didn't look up. She sat on the porch steps, said nothing, but stayed, longer than she ever had. As the sun crawled past the roofline, he finished the last log, set the axe aside, and finally turned toward her. Their eyes met, hers hollowed, his unreadable, but neither looked away, and in that stretch of silence between two people who had lost too much, there was a kind of pact being made. Not one of love, not yet, but presence, of not leaving, of standing when the world leaned too heavy. That night, Maybelle didn't dream of Clyde or her husband. She dreamt of ash, of drawings in charcoal, of firelight that didn't burn, and for the first time she woke with a thought she hadn't dared touch in months. I am still here. Chapter 9. Fever in the Wind. The wind shifted on a Thursday. It came down off the ridgeline carrying the breath of snow that hadn't yet fallen and something else. Something sharp like change riding bareback on cold air. That afternoon Sam didn't touch his cornbread. He sat quiet, as always, but there was a flush high on his cheeks, and when Maybelle reached over to feel his forehead, her fingers stopped. He was burning, skin hot enough to lift the chill from her hand. Ruth stared, wide-eyed. Ellie stood without a word and fetched the old wash basin like she'd done it before. Maybelle carried Sam to the cot and bathed his brow with cool cloths. His lips moved, whispering words she couldn't hear, maybe couldn't even understand. They hadn't heard his voice since the beating months ago, but now he murmured something that sounded like Mama, or maybe mud, or maybe it was just fever speaking in broken memory. Maybelle's breath trembled. She'd buried one child already. She knew the look of death sniffing around the corners of a sickbed. That night, while Ruth clutched her blanket and Ellie watched the door, Maybelle knelt by the cot, forehead to the boards, praying without words. Outside, the wind keened like something lost. Then a door opened. Thatcher stood in the frame. No hat, no coat, just flannel and silence. He didn't ask questions, didn't try comfort. He only looked at Sam for a moment, then turned and walked back into the night. The wind caught the door before it shut fully. Maybelle rose to close it and stood there staring out. Darkness had swallowed the yard. She thought of chasing after him, asking what he was doing, why he left with nothing, but something in her held still, like it trusted whatever he'd gone to do. Hours passed. Ellie drifted off finally on the floor next to Ruth. The fire sank to embers. Sam's breathing hitched, and then hooves on hardpan. Thatcher stepped back in, soaked from the rain that had begun somewhere out in the hills. In one hand, a bottle. In the other, a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He didn't speak. He knelt by Sam's side and passed Maybelle the bottle. Fever drops soaked in herbs and rye. But it was the bundle that made her pause. Inside, it was a necklace. Old silver strung with a pale sapphire, small, delicate, clearly worn once by someone loved. The chain had tarnished, but the stone still caught the firelight. Maybelle looked up. Thatcher's jaw was tight. His voice came quiet, hoarse. Used to hang it above her crib. Said it kept bad dreams away. He didn't say the name of the girl. Didn't say my daughter or my wife. But Maybelle understood. He set it down gently beside Sam, who stirred, eyes fluttering half open for a breath, then slipped back under. "Why, give it to me," she whispered. Her voice felt small, like it didn't belong in this house yet. Thatcher stood, slow. Rainwater dripped from his coat sleeve. "Not because you're their mama," he said, "but because you stayed. You stayed when you didn't have to." And he left the necklace, left it where a boy fighting fever might reach for something cold and real in the night. That night Sam's fever broke just before dawn. Maybelle didn't sleep. She sat on the floor between the cot and the hearth, fingers curled around the frayed edge of her apron, heart beating softer now. In the stillness, Ruth snored gently. Ellie mumbled in her sleep about yellow daisies and Sam. Sam reached out and held the necklace in his hand, his first movement in hours. Maybelle exhaled, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like letting go. Chapter 10. The Dewdrop Hairpin. The morning after Sam's fever broke, the world outside the ranch house was washed clean. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the grass flattened like it had bowed to something greater. Puddles sat in the low spots, catching bits of sky. The fence posts, long bleached by sun and wind, now held the dark weight of wet wood. And the clouds, those slow-moving winter-gray giants, had finally started to drift. Inside the house, the fire had burned low. Maybelle sat near it, hair uncombed, eyes still red from the vigil. Sam was sleeping, properly, peacefully. Ellie had taken Ruth to check on the chicken coop. It was the first time the little ones had left their mother's side in weeks. Maybelle remained on the floor for a long while, watching the soft rise and fall of her son's chest. In the dim light, she reached into her skirt pocket. Her fingers closed around something small, familiar. The hairpin. It had belonged to her mother, worn on church Sundays and tucked into the bun she made every morning before feeding the goats back in Arkansas. Silver, shaped like a teardrop, or a dewdrop depending on the light. It was the last thing of value Maybelle had carried west. Not valuable to anyone else, maybe, but hers. One of the few things not sold, lost, or taken. She rubbed it between her fingers now. The metal was cold, even near the fire. A part of her, the part raised on obligation and hard times, said it was only right to give it to Thatcher, as thanks, as payment, not for shelter, not even for helping Sam, but for how he had looked at her that night, or rather, how he hadn't looked away. When she found him outside repairing the barn hinge later that day, she walked straight up to him and held out her hand. "It's not much," she said, "but it's clean, and it's mine." He looked down at the little thing in her palm, brow creasing. She didn't expect him to say thank you. That wasn't his way. But she didn't expect what came next either. He didn't take it. Instead, he reached for a length of rawhide from the saddlebag nearby, looped it through the pin's base, and without asking, tied it up on the window frame of the house. It swung gently, catching the light just so, like a signal only meant for two people in the world. "We ain't bartering," he said simply. "Not anymore?" Maybelle opened her mouth, closed it. No words would do right by what had just happened. They weren't lovers, not yet. Weren't friends exactly either. But the space between them had shifted, like the gap between fence posts narrowing just enough to pass a thread through. That evening Ruth tugged on her dress and asked what the shiny thing was in the window. "It's a trom," Maybelle said softly, forgetting herself and the tongue of the old country. "It's for remembering someone." "Who?" Ruth asked, tilting her head, but Maybelle didn't answer. The little pin danced in the breeze, and for the first time in years, Maybelle didn't feel the need to explain. It was hers, still hers, but now somehow it belonged here too. Outside, the dusk began to gather. The hills glowed violet under the sinking sun. Sam woke for supper and asked for bread, not with words, but with a small lift of his hand toward the table. Maybelle smiled, took his hand, and squeezed it. Inside the home, things didn't feel borrowed anymore, and for a woman who'd once been put on display like a sack of oats, that alone was a kind of freedom. Chapter 11. When Clyde returned the second time, the spring air had a bite to it that morning, the kind of cold that didn't quite warn you, just crept into your sleeves and sat there like it owned the place. Thatcher was out at the north fence line with Ellie and Sam, checking for breaks from the last windstorm. Ruth stayed behind with Maybelle, helping grind coffee beans on the small table near the stove, her tiny hands mimicking her mother's like a shadow. That's when the sound came. Not a knock, not a whistle, just the slow crunch of boots on the hard-packed dirt outside the house. Maybelle's spine straightened. She set the grinder down, gently nudged Ruth behind her, and stepped toward the window. There he was, Clyde Benton, but this time he wasn't alone. A man stood beside him, tall and thin, wearing a coat that still held the city's dust. His briefcase looked like it had never touched the ground. Behind them, two horses waited, bridled but unburdened, too still for anything good. Clyde's face wore no smile. He looked around like he was appraising a thing he once owned. His eyes stopped on the painted sign by the gate, the one the children had made. The Reed family. Maybelle stepped outside before he could get closer. "You've no business here," she said, voice even. The lawyer cleared his throat, but Clyde lifted a hand. "I always had business with you, Maybelle," he said, in that soft drawl of his that made everything sound like a compliment and a curse at the same time. "The only difference now is I brought it on paper." He held up a folded document, sealed in wax. "Deed claim," he said. "This land isn't his, not fully, and you, well, turns out you were never his to keep." Maybelle didn't flinch, but her hand tightened at her side. "I was never anyone's to keep." Clyde stepped closer, slow. "This place," he motioned, "was promised to a man named Thatcher Reed by a bank in Tucson, and that bank had debts to collect, from your late husband, and from me." He let the words settle like dust. "Now, I could press charges, could drag this out in court till winter." He glanced toward the barn, where the sound of hammering had gone quiet. "But I ain't here to ruin anyone, just want what's owed, and what's mine." That last word hit the air hard. From behind the corner of the barn, Sam appeared, silent, watching. Maybelle moved slightly, blocking his view. "You've said your piece," she told Clyde. "Now go." But he didn't, not yet. He walked to the porch, placed the deed on the railing, and then, as if it were a calling card, set down something else, a silver coin. Old, heavy, the kind they didn't mint anymore. "Recognition of ownership," said the lawyer. Maybelle's jaw clenched. Just then, footsteps behind her. Thatcher. He didn't speak. He simply walked past her, picked up the coin, turned it in his hand once, then walked inside. The smell of smoke came a minute later. Not long, not loud, but strong. He'd thrown it into the stove. When he stepped back out, hands blackened by ash, he faced Clyde and said the only words he would that day. "Try." Clyde's face didn't change, but the lawyer's did. He looked at Clyde, then at Maybelle, then at the children watching from the barn. Whatever they came to do, they no longer had the stomach for it. They left without another word. And though Clyde didn't look back, Maybelle knew the fire behind his eyes wasn't out, just smoldering. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Thatcher pulled a small wooden box from the top shelf. Maybelle had never seen it before. Inside was a folded piece of cloth, and within it a slip of paper, smudged, torn, but legible. Her breath caught. It was the contract Clyde had signed that day at the market, the one he thought was a joke. At the bottom, still stained faintly red, was his thumbprint. "You kept it," she whispered. "Wasn't gonna trust a man who'd sell you once, not to come round again," Thatcher replied, voice low. She reached for the paper, traced the mark with her finger. She didn't know if it would hold in court. Maybe it wouldn't matter. But it was something solid, something that said, "You were worth keeping." Thatcher placed the paper back in the box, slid it away without fanfare. Neither of them said another word that night, but when she reached for his hand before blowing out the lantern, he didn't pull away. And that was enough. Chapter 12. A name written on wood. The storm that had rattled the roof the night before, it passed like a warning unheeded, leaving behind a morning cool and still, the kind that made the world feel half forgotten. The yard was wet, the ground soft under boots, and low fog hugged the fences like breath clinging to old skin. But inside the house, something had shifted. The children were whispering, no longer out of fear, but excitement. Ellie tugged on her boots before the laces were tight. Ruth dropped her biscuit halfway through breakfast, and Sam had a piece of wood in his hand. It was just a narrow board, smoothed down by someone's patient work, edges sanded where splinters might have been. Across the middle, in bright blue paint, uneven but proud, Ellie had written, "The Reed Family." It wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't a question, it was fact. Ruth, small fingers stained green, had drawn little vines curling from the corners. Some ended in stars, others in flowers. Sam had added a lopsided, smiling face in the dickey of Reed. He couldn't speak, but what he painted said more than most grown men ever could. They brought it to Maybelle like it was treasure. "It needs hanging," Ellie said, "right by the front gate." Maybelle stared at it a long moment, her throat tightening in that slow, creeping way it did when joy and grief tried to crowd the same breath. She looked toward Thatcher. He was standing by the shed sharpening an old handsaw, but paused. Their eyes met. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, but he didn't stop them either, and in that silence, permission was given. Maybelle took the board, hands careful. The sun broke through clouds just then, thin and golden, and she stepped outside with the children trailing behind her. They carried nails and a hammer, the old kind with a split handle someone had wrapped in twine. Sam carried the hammer, both hands on the wooden grip like it was a promise. At the gate, Maybelle pressed the sign against the old beam. "You sure?" she asked them, voice low. "We are now," Ellie said. Maybelle held the board, and Sam swung the hammer. The sound rang clear. 1, 2, 3, and the name held fast. That afternoon, neighbors rode past slower than usual. No one said a word, but they looked, they saw. And word would travel. That house out near Bitter Ridge, the one with the widowed girl and those 3 small kids. It had a name on it now, and names had power. That evening, while Maybelle mended Sam's shirt, and the girls arranged wildflowers into mismatched cups, music floated through the walls. It was soft at first, so faint it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. It was a mandolin. Thatcher's, pulled from the old chest under his bed. He'd been mending it for weeks in secret, sanding it when no one was watching, restringing it during the last rain. The tune wasn't polished, but it was warm. Maybelle stood in the doorway, listening. Her hand still held the needle mid-stitch, but she didn't move. The children sat on the floor near the fire, heads tilted, and for the first time the house felt full, not just with people, but with belonging, not just with noise, but with something earned, note by note. The sign outside was no grand announcement. It wasn't carved in iron. It wasn't painted by any skilled hand. But it was there, and in a place where so many had passed through, without leaving so much as footprints. Maybelle Reed, once a woman sold to settle another man's debt, had become a woman whose name lived on wood, not as a mark of ownership, but of presence and of staying. Chapter 13, A Wedding Without Words, a Bond Without Rings. The spring had crept in without fanfare, just soft breezes, a warmer scent in the grass, and the faint green shimmer on the hills, like a new beginning too, shy to announce itself. On the morning it happened, there were no invitations, no preacher riding up with his Bible bound in cracked leather, no ribbons tied to trees or pie tables set in the yard. But wildflowers had begun to bloom across the western field, violet and gold, trembling in the wind like a congregation holding its breath. And that was enough. Maybelle stood in front of the cracked mirror, smoothing a dress Ruth had mended with her own small hands. The stitches were uneven, the thread a soft blue not quite matching the cotton. But it held. Like most things here now did. She didn't wear perfume, there wasn't any, but tucked a sprig of mint behind her ear, the way her mother once did when heading to market. Her hands shook a little, not from fear, from the weight of being chosen after all this time. Out front, Ellie and Ruth crowned each other with rings of clover. Sam ran barefoot through the fresh grass, chasing a dust-colored cat, who no longer flinched at his footsteps. The sky was that deep western blue, the kind you only get after a hard winter. Thatcher waited by the fence. He wore the same shirt he'd worn when he first brought her home, a bit less stiff now, the collar softened by sun and soap. His hat was off, his hands empty, but his posture was steady as oak. He didn't speak when she approached. He just looked at her, and that was enough. No vows were spoken. No one pronounced them man and wife. But the look he gave her, quiet, certain, a little bruised by the years but still standing, was the kind of promise words would only cheapen. He reached into his pocket, not for a ring, but for the thin silver chain, his late wife's sapphire necklace that he'd given her once before during Sam's fevered night. This time he placed it gently in her palm and closed her fingers around it. "You don't have to wear it," he said, his voice rough. "It's not for show, it's just so you know. You're not passing through." Maybelle looked down at the necklace, then back at him. "I never wanted a wedding," she said softly. "Only a place I wouldn't be sent away from." She slipped the necklace over her head, and the stone settled just above her heart. Behind them, the children gathered near, not entirely sure what had just happened, but knowing something had changed. Ruth took Maybelle's hand. Ellie reached for Thatcher's and Sam. Sam reached out and grabbed both. They stood that way for a moment, 5 people in a field of spring bloom, watched only by hawks above and a horse munching grass nearby. There was no music, no cake, no dancing, but in the hush of that meadow, with wind moving the tall grass like a hymn without lyrics, they were bound tighter than most who ever stood in chapels. Later, Maybelle would press the worn trem kai tok, her mother's last gift, into the doorway post of the house, just beneath the hanging sign. Thatcher wouldn't ask why. He'd just nod once and hang his hat beside it as though the act itself was sacred. That night, as dusk painted the walls in long shadows, she lay beside him, not with urgency or fire, but the steady calm of someone finally safe. They didn't talk much, but before sleep found them, he said the only words that mattered. "You don't have to be my wife. Just be the one I get to sit beside, long as this place holds." And in the dark, with the scent of mint and clean linen around them, Maybelle whispered the only answer she had ever needed to give. "I'm staying." Chapter 14. No longer a debt, only a home. The wind came soft that morning, no longer sharp like it used to be when she stood on auction planks or sat by lonesome windows. It brushed past the cabin like a friend who had learned not to knock, carrying the scent of wild sage, coffee, and the faint smoke of warming coals. From the porch the world stretched wide and golden, rimmed with cottonwoods just starting to leaf again. Maybelle poured 2 cups of coffee. Her hands no longer trembled. One she set by the far side of the table, where Thatcher sat now each morning before checking fence lines. The other she kept between her palms, warming fingers that had once known only scrubbing floors and hiding trembling children behind skirts. Behind her, inside the cabin, Ellie was helping Ruth brush her hair. Sam sat by the window, drawing in his small notebook with a piece of charcoal. Today it looked like he was sketching a horse, but it had the face of their old cat. He smiled at it. He smiled often now. They didn't call it school. But they learned here words, fire, safety, the rhythm of chores, how to listen to wind. The name, the Reed family, still hung over the door. The paint had faded a bit, but Maybelle had no mind to repaint it. Let time soften the edges. It was written once by children who didn't know if they belonged, and now they did. She stepped outside, apron fluttering in the morning breeze. Thatcher was leaning on the railing, eyes scanning the tree line, still cautious, but no longer waiting for the past to knock. "Coffee's hot," she said, and it was almost unnecessary. The steam told him so. He took the cup with a small nod and sat down. She joined him. A silence followed, but not the kind that weighs heavy. This one was light, familiar, like the breath before music. Clyde never came back. Some said he rode south and never stopped. Others said he died in a border town brawl, looking for someone to blame. It didn't matter. His name wasn't spoken here. His coin had long since melted in the old stove, twisted and black, buried with the ashes of every other cruelty. What remained was this: a woman who no longer woke in panic, 3 children who no longer whispered from closets, and a man who didn't speak much but always brought the horses in before rain and remembered which child liked honey in their tea. Some evenings they played music. Thatcher plucked the C mandolin slow, and Ellie would try to hum along, though she never remembered all the notes. Ruth would dance barefoot in the dust. Sam once stood clear as a bell and said, "Mama," just once. That was enough. Maybelle often thought about the beginning, about the gavel striking the auction block, about her shame, about the days someone offered not gold or cattle, but a braided string of fish bones to buy her freedom. Now she wore the sapphire necklace only when the girls asked. Mostly it hung by the bedside, beside her mother's tram si talk, tokens not of debt, but of the lives they'd outlived. "Thatcher," she asked once during a quiet dusk, "did you ever think you'd end up here, like this?" He didn't answer right away, just reached out, hooked his finger around hers and said, "Didn't think I'd end up anywhere." She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. Inside, someone knocked over a cup. Ruth laughed. The cat yowled. Sam yelled something half-formed. Life. It wasn't tidy, it wasn't quiet, but it was theirs. And for the first time in years, maybe in her whole life, Maybelle knew with bone-deep certainty she wasn't anyone's burden. She wasn't anyone's debt. She was home. Out in the quiet country where wind carries more stories than voices, sometimes all it takes is one small kindness to rewrite a life. Maybelle wasn't saved by a grand gesture. She was saved by a man who didn't ask questions, who made room without taking space, and little by little, the house that once echoed with fear filled with warmth, laughter, and names written in paint. If you've ever felt like a burden or known the power of being seen even just once, tell us in the comments what part of this story stayed with you. In the West, we don't always say much, but we remember, and we stay.